Tartaria, what happened to it? The official answer, when you can find one at all, is vague to the point of meaninglessness. It dissolved, it fragmented, it was just a vague label on a couple of maps. Various successor states emerged, the people became Russians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Siberians. The name just faded. Over time, gradually. Except that's not what the maps show. The deeper I looked, the more I noticed something that I cannot explain with the word gradually. Because the timeline, when you actually examine it, isn't gradual at all. Between roughly 1750 and 1850, a window of 100 years, the largest territorial entity ever mapped disappears from cartographic history. The name disappears, the administrative records disappear, the institutional memory disappears, and in its place, with extraordinary speed and with extraordinary uniformity, rises a new order. New nations, new borders, new banking systems, new architectural styles, families like the Rothschilds, new royal families, many of whom appear as if from nowhere, suddenly seated on ancient thrones with freshly minted pedigrees. This raises a simple but critical question. Who benefited? Let me describe something to you. A pattern. In 1701, the Kingdom of Prussia is formally established. Its first king, Frederick I, consolidates land, banking, and military authority with a speed that contemporary observers found remarkable. Where did the institutional knowledge come from? Where did the administrative infrastructure come from? Who trained the bureaucrats, built the roads, organized the tax collection in a kingdom that, officially speaking, had barely existed as a coherent entity a generation before? The official explanation is that Prussia simply organized itself. Talented men rose, systems emerged. This didn't happen in Prussia alone, but across the continent and then across the world with unsettling precision. In 1762, Catherine II takes the Russian throne. A German-born princess with no blood claim to Russian sovereignty consolidates control over the largest landmass in history with remarkable ease. She doesn't merely rule, she redefines, she commissions new maps, she reorganizes provincial administration, she relocates populations, she creates, almost from scratch, a new historiography of Russia that emphasizes continuity with ancient Rus, while conspicuously minimizing what had existed in the territories she now controls. Why? What was in those territories that needed to be re-narrated? Move forward 40 years, Napoleon crosses Europe. We're told this is conquest, the ambition of a singular military genius. And perhaps it is, but look at what follows Napoleon everywhere he goes. Not just soldiers, administrators, lawyers carrying new legal codes, surveyors with new instruments, bankers establishing new financial relationships. The Napoleonic Code doesn't just reorganize law, it reorganizes property. Who owns what? Who can own what? Who can transfer what to whom across generations? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This isn't just conquest. This is cadastral reorganization, the systematic re-recording of who owns the land. And here's the strangest part. The families who appear in positions of authority in the post-Napoleonic settlement, the Congress of Vienna, 1815, many of them are the same families, or families with demonstrable connections to the same families who had quietly accumulated influence in the decades immediately preceding the French Revolution. Before the chaos, before the reset, as if they knew the chaos was coming, or arranged it. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise. I am not telling you there was a secret council in a candlelit room. I am not telling you that men in robes drew up a plan and executed it over centuries. That would be too simple. Reality, I've come to believe, is messier and stranger than that. What I am telling you is this. The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidence. When you trace the genealogies of the families who emerge in positions of financial and territorial dominance in the 19th century, the great banking dynasties of Frankfurt and London and Amsterdam, the newly elevated noble families of the post-Napoleonic order, the colonial merchant families who suddenly find themselves controlling the administrative apparatus of entire continents, you find, with startling regularity, the same surnames, the same intermarriages, the same godparents appearing across generations, the same families present at the founding of new national banks, new colonial trading companies, new constitutional monarchies that replaced older and less legible power structures. Not coincidence, not luck, not talent alone. Pattern. The Rothschild family is perhaps the most documented example, and so the most discussed, but discussing them in isolation misses the point entirely. What's significant isn't a single family. What's significant is the network. Frankfurt to London to Paris to Vienna to Naples. 5 sons, 5 cities, 5 central positions in 5 newly reorganized European financial systems, all established within the same 2-decade window, all immediately following the Napoleonic reorganization of Europe. The timing alone demands explanation, but the Rothschilds are visible precisely because they are visible. They kept records. They wrote letters that survived. What about the families who were more careful? What about the networks operating behind the chartered trading companies, the East India Company, the Dutch VOC, whose internal ownership records were conveniently lost, damaged, or simply never made public? The deeper I went, the more I noticed the absences. If you're finding this compelling, subscribe and stay with me, because what comes next is where the pattern becomes truly difficult to explain. Here is the question that, for me, transformed this from an interesting historical anomaly into something that keeps me awake at night. How do you coordinate across continents in an era before telecommunications, before air travel, before any of the modern infrastructure we associate with worldwide coordination, and achieve results that appear uniform? Consider what happens in the century between 1780 and 1880. In North America, a colonial revolution establishes a new republic. The land of an entire continent, land that had been inhabited, administered, named, and organized by existing populations for generations, is systematically surveyed, recatalogued, and transferred into private ownership through a series of legal instruments: the General Land Office, the Township and Range Survey System, land grants to railroad companies that, in some cases, exceeded the territory of entire European nations. In South America, Spanish colonial authority collapses across an entire continent within roughly 30 years. New republics emerge, and almost immediately, British banking houses establish relationships with these new governments. Loans are extended, infrastructure is financed, and the collateral, in many cases, is land, resources, mining rights, the physical territory of newly independent nations mortgaged to creditors in London before the Revolutionary Wars are even fully concluded. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In Africa, formerly in this period still a continent of diverse and complex kingdoms, the groundwork is being laid for what will become, in the 1880s, the most explicit land grab in human history. The Berlin Conference of 1884, 14 nations sitting in a room in Germany, dividing a continent they do not own, have never surveyed, have never administered, drawing lines on a map. Not one African ruler is in the room, and those lines, drawn in one conference room, in one city, in one weekend, still define national borders that people are dying over today. How is this coordinated? Who has the authority, the relationships, the financial leverage to bring 14 competing colonial powers into agreement over the partition of an entire continent? What is the connective tissue between the banking houses financing these colonial ventures, the royal families providing their nominal authority, and the surveying and administrative apparatus that immediately follows military conquest to re-register ownership of land? This raises a simple but critical question. Is this what happens when a vacuum is filled, or is this what happens when a vacuum is created? Let me return to Tartaria, because here is where the official explanation doesn't just strain, it breaks. If the largest nation on earth simply dissolved, as we're told, if it fragmented peacefully, gradually, into its constituent peoples, then we would expect certain things to be true. we would expect administrative records, transition documents, something equivalent to what we have for every other major political transition in recorded history. The dissolution of the Roman Empire generated centuries of documentation. The collapse of the Ming dynasty generated libraries of records. The end of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century generated an enormous paper trail that historians still work through today. Where is the equivalent documentation for Tartaria? The silence is deafening. What we have instead is re-narration. The great Siberian and Central Asian expeditions of the 18th century, officially described as scientific voyages of discovery, produce new maps that progressively minimize and then eliminate the Tartarian designation. The expeditions are funded by newly reorganized European powers. The scientists who conduct them report to newly established academies of science, themselves funded by the same aristocratic and banking networks that are, simultaneously, reorganizing land tenure across the continent. Not exploration, not discovery, overwriting. And here's what I find most striking. The architecture doesn't disappear. Walk through Kazan today, or Astrakhan, or Samarkand, or a dozen cities across the former Tartarian territories, and you find structures whose construction the official historical record cannot adequately explain. Buildings whose foundations, whose dimensions, whose material composition suggest resources and organizational capacity that the small regional principalities were told preceded the Russian Empire simply should not have had. Who built them? The official answers are unsatisfying. Local rulers, we're told, regional trade networks, organic development. But organic development doesn't produce the kind of uniform architectural vocabulary you find across thousands of miles, the same proportions, the same building materials, the same relationship between structures and their civic surroundings, across territories that were supposedly disconnected. Unless there was once a civilization coordinating that architecture. A civilization that has since been, forgotten, deliberately obscured, reattributed. So let me ask the uncomfortable question directly. If there was a civilization, call it Tartaria, call it something else, the name matters less than the reality. And if that civilization was disrupted, dismantled, and deliberately overwritten within a specific historical window, then someone inherited what it left behind. Someone inherited the land. Someone inherited the trade routes, the agricultural systems, the mineral deposits, the forests, the rivers. Someone inherited the institutional knowledge, the administrative techniques, the surveying methods, the engineering capabilities that allowed new empires to rise so rapidly where old ones had apparently impossibly vanished. The deeper I went into the genealogies of the great landowning families of the 19th and 20th centuries, the families who, through various legal instruments, came to control the majority of arable land across Eurasia and the Americas, the more a particular pattern emerged. These are not families with ancient, clearly documented histories stretching back 1,000 years. They are families with histories that become clear, well documented and legally formalized within a very specific window. The 18th and 19th centuries, the same window in which Tartaria disappears from the maps. Their wealth does not grow, it appears, suddenly. With documentation that begins conveniently after the period of maximum disruption. Is that a coincidence? And what about the royal families who populate Europe's thrones in this same period? The House of Hanover, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the House of Romanov in its final consolidated form. These are families whose claims to legitimacy rest on genealogies that, when examined closely, are thinner than they appear. Genealogies assembled in some cases by the very court historians employed by the families themselves. Not ancient bloodlines, not immemorial dynasties. Recent constructions carefully documented, strategically placed. And here's what I find impossible to ignore. The degree of intermarriage between these families, across national borders, across what were supposedly competing imperial interests, across the religious divisions that officially defined European politics is extraordinary. By 1900, virtually every ruling dynasty in Europe can be traced to a common set of ancestors within 5 or 6 generations. They are, in a very literal genealogical sense, one extended family. One family. Sitting on the thrones of competing empires, controlling, through various financial and legal instruments, the central banking systems of those same competing empires, presiding over the colonial apparatus that was simultaneously extracting wealth from the rest of the planet. This raises a simple but critical question. Are these families the inheritors of something? And if so, what exactly did they inherit? And from whom? And at what cost? There is something I keep returning to, something that feels to me like the heart of this mystery. It's not the land, not entirely. Land can be documented, surveyed. Its transfer can, at least in principle, be traced. The paper trail is incomplete, but it exists in fragments. What cannot be easily traced is knowledge. The engineering knowledge that built the structures we cannot adequately explain. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the orientations of those structures. The medical and agricultural knowledge that allowed populations to survive in climates that should, by any modern assessment, have made large-scale civilization impossible. The navigational knowledge that appears fully formed in the hands of European maritime explorers who, officially, were venturing into unknown waters, and yet somehow knew where they were going with a precision that their instruments, officially, should not have allowed. Where does this knowledge come from? The official explanation that it was independently developed organically through a natural accumulation of discovery and experiment grows less convincing the more carefully you examine the timeline. The evidence suggests something much larger, a body of knowledge accumulated over a longer period and across a wider geography than official history acknowledges, that was transferred rather than developed. Transferred through channels we can only partially see to the institutions and families who emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries at the commanding heights of a world-spanning civilization. Not created, inherited. Here is what I come back to, again and again. The thing that makes official history feel to me like an incomplete explanation. The scale of coordination required to do what appears to have been done, to erase a civilization from the maps, to reattribute its infrastructure, to re-narrate its history, to transfer its resources and knowledge to a new class of owners, is extraordinary. It is the kind of coordination that strains credulity when attributed to coincidence or to the gradual organic workings of history. Not one region, not 2, not 3, but every inhabited continent, within roughly the same historical window, experiencing the same process, the same disruption, the same re-narration, the same consolidation of land and resources into the hands of a relatively small and demonstrably interconnected group of families and institutions. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and patterns in history as in nature suggest causes. I am not telling you I know what that cause is. I am genuinely uncertain. I hold this as a question, not an answer, but I am asking you to consider what it means if the question is real. If there was once a different way of organizing human civilization, broader, older, more distributed than what we're taught, and if that civilization was disrupted, and if the disruption benefited specific families who have since shaped the world we live in, what does that mean for the world we live in? What does it mean for the institutions we trust? What does it mean for the history books we were handed in school, written by scholars, employed by universities, endowed by foundations, created by the very families whose origins we're now questioning? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the honest truth of where this research has left me. I started with a map, an old map from a reliable source showing a nation that should be as famous as Rome, a nation that educated people have never heard of, a nation whose disappearance generated, as far as I can find, almost no documentation, no mourning, no historical reckoning of the kind we extend even to far smaller political entities. And the deeper I went, the more I found not answers, but the shape of answers, the outline of something, a set of patterns too consistent, too worldwide, too precisely timed to dismiss as coincidence. Families who appear, suddenly wealthy and suddenly powerful, in the exact historical window when something vast was apparently disappearing. Institutions, banks, academies, trading companies, surveying organizations that emerge with extraordinary speed and capability, as if drawing on a reservoir of knowledge and organizational capacity that official history does not account for. Architecture that predates the civilizations officially credited with building it. Maps that have been quietly revised, editions that have been quietly discontinued, archives that are, when you go looking for them, incomplete in ways that seem almost deliberate. The silence was deafening. What I cannot tell you, what I genuinely do not know, is the full shape of what was lost. Was Tartaria an empire in the conventional sense, a network of related cultures, something we don't have an adequate word for? Was the knowledge that was transferred, if it was transferred, scientific, spiritual, both? Were the families who inherited it aware of what they were inheriting, or did they simply take what was there, as conquerors always have, without fully understanding it? I don't know. And here's what haunts me most. If a civilization can be that thoroughly erased, mapped out of existence, administratively overwritten, architecturally reattributed, genealogically silenced, then what else might have been erased? What other chapters of human history are we missing? What other maps in first editions of encyclopedias we never open show nations and peoples and ways of organizing human life that have since been quietly removed from the story we tell ourselves? History, we are told, is what happened. But maybe history is also what someone decided we should remember, and maybe, just maybe, the families who decided what we should remember are the same families who benefited most from what was forgotten. I don't have the final answer, but I don't think the question goes away.